Okay, so before we talk about the reflection paper that's coming up, just two quick things. First, so you're going to be reading the excerpt from Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes for next time. I'll give you guide questions for that at the end of class. But I do want you to note that this one is going to be a little difficult, right? It's 17th century prose, so it's a little bit hard to get through. I am confident that you can do it, or I wouldn't assign it. But you're probably going to need to go a little bit more slowly with it, right? And you're going to have to probably spend a little bit more time paying close and careful attention to parsing sentences, right? So that you fully understand what's going on. How many of you are taking American government right now? Anybody? Nobody's taking American government right now. Okay, so nobody knows anything about social contract theory? This is completely unfamiliar? Okay, we'll talk about it when we talk about Hobbes then. All right, so the reflection paper assignment I've just given you. So, what you're going to be doing is taking one of the texts that we've read so far, right? So you can use Confucius, you can use the Tacitus, or you can use Tawfiq al-Hakim, right? And you're going to isolate in that text a single strand, binary, or anomaly that you think is particularly meaningful, right? So you're going to look for some pattern of similarity, of opposition, or something that just doesn't seem to fit any pattern but still seems like it means something important, right? You're then going to choose a quote from the text that you think best represents that pattern or theme, and you're going to copy it at the top of the page. Then you're going to break this quote down in order to construct an argument about some meaning that is implied by the text, right? So remember that when we say implied, right, we mean something that wouldn't be immediately obvious to anyone reading it, right? Something that it suggests, not something that it outright literally says. And what you're going to be doing is working towards a possible working thesis, right? So usually you put the thesis at the beginning of your paper, right? You know, it's the last sentence or so of the introduction, everything that follows is supposed to help demonstrate the thesis, right? This is actually what we call thesis-seeking writing, right? You're actually looking to construct a thesis. And this is what you should actually be doing before you start writing a longer paper, right? We tend to begin writing with a thesis already in mind, and we always try to write the introduction first, right? The problem with that is that it locks us into an idea before we've really explored what we think. So the idea here is to get down on paper what you think before you try to make an argument about it, right? And then when you do the longer formal paper, you'll already have a couple of these reflection papers, maybe one of them you can use as a starting point, right? And you can then kind of reverse this, right? So what we're doing is an exercise essentially in inductive reasoning. Which is most of what we've been doing in this class so far, really, right? We lay out a bunch of data, right? We try to get ideas from it. So a lot of the writing you're probably used to doing is what we call deductive, right? When you're doing deductive reasoning, you start with a general principle. And you apply specific examples. Do any of you know what a syllogism is? I'm going to take your silence to mean no. Okay, so a syllogism is kind of like the classic demonstration of formal logic, right? it works by deductive reasoning. So have you ever seen anything like this? All human beings are mortal. Socrates is a human being. Therefore, Socrates is mortal, right? So you're taking this general principle and applying it to a specific case. That's deductive reasoning. This is actually what we'll talk probably more about this and what it's useful for in a later session, but this is what I don't want you doing, right? I don't want you starting with a general principle. Instead, what I want you doing is examining specific examples to determine a general principle, right? So when, we are laying out evidence, right? We're just laying out pieces of data and we're looking for patterns in them, right? Essentially what you're doing is looking for a meaningful pattern. And what your paper should culminate in is a potential argument about that meaningful pattern that you've located, right? So does anybody have any questions about this so far? Take a minute, think about it. If there's anything that's unclear to you about what you're supposed to do here.
So if we, kind of write down what we think or whatever, like you said, would it be wrong if we wrote things like perhaps this happened, or perhaps using perhaps as something that we might think could happen? Would that be wrong to use things like that? Assuming, I guess.
Yeah. So that's a tricky question. If you're thinking of it like in terms of perhaps this means X, right? That's okay. If you're thinking about it more in terms of
if it was he did blank, and I was perhaps he did this because blank.
Okay, so try to avoid making any kind of assumptions about other people's behavior, whether it's the author's behavior or the character's behavior or whatever, right? That actually brings me to a point that I want to talk about. Right? So the first thing I've got down here underneath all of the formal requirements here, right? And this is just the normal stuff, right? The normal formal requirements. It's 500 to 750 words, 12-point Times New Roman font, double spaced. And I do want you to do proper MLA citation this time with parenthetical notation. If you don't know how to do this, I've given you a link here for the Purdue Online Writing Labs citation page. And it'll tell you how to do a proper bibliography. It'll tell you how to do proper in-text citations, right? And if you have any questions, then just come to me and ask me. But I think, to Hannah's question here, right? So if we look at the first point that I've got here in terms of guidelines, right? So you are going to want to locate the text you're reading in a specific interpretive context, right? This is what we've been doing all along here, right? So it can be a historical context. So, you can try to say, look at, the Confucius piece in light of social upheaval in the spring and autumn period in Chinese history, right? You can look at the Tacitus piece in light of, the Romans' wars of conquest in the 1st century CE. The piece we're going to talk about today, I'm going to give you a historical context for that as well. But we've also sometimes talked about different kinds of contexts of ideas, right? Like when we looked at the Mayflower Compact a couple weeks ago, we were thinking of it not just in terms of the history surrounding it, but also kind of where it fits in terms of American and British legal rhetoric and things like that, right? So any kind of context you can stick the text in that helps you understand what it's doing is going to help you understand it, right? It's going to help you make an argument about it. One thing that I do want to really, really stress here, though, right? If you choose a historical context, I swear, like, I won't actually murder anyone who uses the phrase back in the day, but I will want to. Okay? Can anyone guess why I find the phrase back in the day infuriating?
Because it's very vague.
It's incredibly vague, yeah. And it just suggests that history doesn't matter, right? That everything that happened before you were born is this jumble of events that happen in no particular order and has no particular influence on anything, right? And one of the things I'm trying to get across here is the context really does matter, right? The context shapes thought, and context shapes language and the way we use it. So please treat specific contexts with importance, right? Okay. In addition, pay attention to word choice. So remember, there's no such thing as a true synonym, right? There are no two words that mean exactly the same thing in any given language. And every word carries particular shades of meaning and symbolic or emotional associations. So when you run into these kinds of words, like, think about the different shades of meaning that the word suggests, right? Think about the other ideas that we tend to attach to these words, and why use this particular word here instead of another one that means something similar, right? Third, the thesis that you come up with has to be arguable, right? Arguable in this case means three things. It means, one, that it's supported by evidence from the text. Two, that it's an idea that would not be immediately obvious to anyone who read the text. And three, that it is a position with which another reader could conceivably disagree, right? So what I'm saying here in this last piece is that you have to stake out a position, right? Don't just say there are many pros and cons to blah, 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 or there are many ways of looking at blah, 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 or so on and so forth, right? I want you to take a firm position on whatever your argument is. Finally, since the overall purpose is to help you come up with a thesis you can use as your starting point for a longer paper, pick a text that you wouldn't mind spending a little bit more time with, right? So pick a text, like, the best thing to do is, probably, of the three texts we've read so far, pick the one that you found most interesting, right? And I've got all the due dates for these listed here. They're also on the syllabus, and the due dates are correct in Georgia View now. Does anybody have any questions about this? Any further questions? Take your time. We're in no hurry.
I'm confused. This probably sounds like a dumb question, but on the front, it says, like, the formal requirements. It says 500, 700 words, right?
Uh-huh.
On the back, why does it say, like, sustain 1,000 to 1,500 words?
Because the longer paper that you're going to write at midterm is 1,000 to 1,500 words.
Oh,
Yeah,
my God.
yeah.
Would I be like off of this one? Or?
That's exactly what I'm expecting y'all are going to do, right? So what you're gonna do with these shorter reflection pieces, right, is come up with a thesis that you might be able to use for a longer paper, right? That's the whole purpose of these.
So these are basically practice ones until the midterm.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And could we also, like, when the midterm comes around, say our previous little homework assignments, we could pull information from those, maybe?
Probably not, because the midterm paper is going to require you to address one of the tests that you're doing in Reading the World, right? So the reflection papers will be better. The homework will help you practice. It was to help you practice skills, and so are these. But these will help you actually practice skills on these specific texts.
When's the midterm again?
Let me double check. Yeah, midterm is sometime in October. Yeah, I mean, time moves fast, right? Like, we're already 4 or 5 weeks into the
I
semester
could go
now.
home in 2 months.
Did you know we only have 32 every class?
We have a 32 what?
Classes for every class.
We would.
Wait,
What?
Like, in the whole semester, we only.
We have 32, yeah, we meet 32 times, yeah.
32 times.
That's it?
What?
Yeah. Yeah, well, we meet twice a week for 75 minutes. I mean, that's, yeah.
Huh.
So, so if it feels like this goes fast, it does. It's, yeah, we don't actually spend that much time together. Okay, so yeah, the draft of paper 1 is going to be due on the 13th of October, so in a little less than a month. And the paper itself is going to be due exactly a month from today.
Oh, Jesus. Oh, my God. Okay.
Well, this is why we're getting started on this now.
Anxiety. Okay.
Yep. Right, there's no need to freak out. There are plenty of resources available if you need help, right? You can always, and I want to stress this with the reflection papers as well, right? Like if you want me to look at something before you turn it in, I'm happy to do that, right?
Could we just like email you?
Yeah, you can shoot me an email, yeah. Now the thing is you have to give me sufficient time, right?
Yeah.
Can I overnight them?
Yeah, so
Like,
so
2 hours.
Let's say
yeah, like 2 hours before I can't help you, right? But if you get it done like Tuesday, and you want me to look at it before you submit it on Wednesday.
Oh yeah, I
I'm
was
happy to
even
do
gonna
that,
say like if I went and did it tonight and sent you it later tonight.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Yeah,
Yeah, we can do
You
it.
guys
again.
can help me?
Yeah, we
Yeah.
can do it during study hall.
but no, that is that is part of what I'm here for, right? So yeah, please do send me your work,
Okay.
and I'm happy to look it over for you and help you out with it. There's also the writing center, right? So you can always make appointments at the
How does
writing
the
center.
writing-
Yeah, what even like
Yeah,
how does that work?
Okay, so yeah, this actually might be a useful detour if no one knows how to make appointments at the writing center. I think that they're doing all their appointments online now.
Where even is the writing center?
It is in the library.
Library?
In fact, probably the best thing for you to do would be if you need to know how to schedule an appointment, just go to the library. If you go all the way to the back of the first floor, right? Like if you go past the reception desk, there's the computer banks.
And then the stairway?
Yeah, and then there's the stairway, and then the writing center is on the other side of the stairway. So if
The
you're
left side?
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you're facing the back of the building,
Yeah.
the writing center is on is in the back on the left.
Oh.
Yep.
It's basically just write in there? Or like,
Well, what you do is you bring an assignment with you, and if you're going, bring the assignment sheet too, so they know what you're working on.
oh, so I could just bring like this and tell her like what reflection I'm doing and then just basically go to town? Like do that?
Yeah, and then they'll help you work through
Oh,
it. Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Oh,
It's usually better
that's
if
cool.
they'll usually work better if you already have something, like you've already done some work that they can.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is what they do there.
Never knew that.
Okay. Any other questions?
Is everybody in here working?
No.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so then let's dive into today's material. How did this go? What did you guys think of the Sultan's Dilemma?
Oh, the what?
I couldn't pronounce his name.
The Sultan's Dilemma.
How do you actually say like
Tawfiq al-Hakim, yeah, that's pretty much just how it's spelled.
I struggled, but yeah.
I think there was a lot of back and forth of like this
Yeah.
saying the same thing.
Okay,
Yeah, very repetitive.
okay, why? Do you think it had this repetitive structure? Like, is there any difference each time the arguments repeat? What's the basic problem they're trying to solve here?
If we should go the law or force.
Okay, yeah. The basic dilemma is between what they term the law and the sword, right? So these are the solutions, right, that they're weighing. But what's the actual problem they're trying to solve?
Because he was gonna be enslaved or something, and they're trying to see how to like go about making that right again.
Yeah, so this is an excerpt, like, and maybe part of the problem is that, you know, this is just like 6 pages from a much longer play, right? So because maybe you don't have the surrounding context, it might be a little harder to figure out what's going on. But the basic problem here, yes, the Sultan right, that is, the king, right, the ruler, has just discovered that he is still legally enslaved, right? He was purchased as a young child by the previous sultan who had no children of his own, and then raised as a son, and then inherited his father's throne. But the previous sultan never bothered to set him free legally, right? So the basic legal problem here, and it is a legal problem, right, is that the sultan is a slave and he can't be the sultan if he is a slave, right? So could any of you figure out who he actually belongs to right now? If we look on page 343, can somebody read this, the first paragraph here, like the Qadi speech? And Qadi is an Arabic word that means judge. Anybody? 343? Oh, into the fact that in the eyes of the law.
Owing to the fact that in the eyes of the law, you are a chattel?
Chattel.
Chattel?
Do you all know what chattel means, what this word means?
Nope.
Okay, so chattel is a word that means property, but it's usually property that is alive, right? So chattel would be, a slave would be chattel, livestock would be chattel, right? Things like that. It's usually a way to kind of like turn a living thing into an object, right? Okay, so go ahead, keep reading, Hannah.
Owned by the late Sultan, you have become part of his inheritance, and as he died without leaving an heir, his estate reverts to
the exchequer, that's the state treasury, right?
You are thus one of the chattel, how do you say it?
Chattel.
Chattel, owned by the
Exchequer.
exchequer.
Mm-hmm.
An unproductive chattel yielding no profit or return. I, in my additional capacity as treasurer of the exchequer, say it is the custom in such cases to get rid of unprofitable chattels by putting them up for sale at an auction, so that the good interests of the exchequer be not harmed, and so that it may utilize the proceeds of the sale and bring benefit to the people generally and in particular to the poor.
Okay, so who owns the Sultan?
The exchequer?
Yeah, the exchequer, right? And because the exchequer is the state treasury, right? By extension, then, who owns the Sultan?
The state.
The state owns him, right? He's owned by the government. And what does the law say has to be done in this case? How is this problem to be resolved under law?
Have you put up for sale? At
Yeah.
auction?
He is to put up for sale at auction, yeah. And then what happens to the proceeds from the auction?
They give the proceeds to like benefit the poor and stuff?
Yeah. So he's put up for auction, and then the proceeds from the auction are distributed back to the people, right? So in a way, the ruler here is property of his people. He's owned by the state, and the proceeds from his being auctioned will be used to benefit the people of that state, right? Now, what's the other possible solution here? The sword. How is this another way out of it? What if he doesn't want to put himself up for auction? What else could the Sultan do? What's that? Well, I mean, in a very specific way, right? He could fight it. But if you look on the bottom of page 343, the Sultan says, "Listen, Qadi, this law of yours has brought me no solution, whereas a small movement of my sword will ensure that the knot of the problem is severed instantly." And the Qadi responds, "Then do so." Right?
Who is he killing?
There's one, the guy who knows the secret, right? He, so if we read the introduction, right, there's one person who knows that the Sultan was never set free, and the other thing the Sultan could do if he doesn't want to put himself up for auction and subject himself to public humiliation is what? Yeah, he can just kill the guy who knows the secret, right? He would probably have to kill the Qadi too, right? So, what's the difference between these two solutions?
One is right and one is wrong.
Okay, which one seems more right to us? Okay, yeah, the following the law, right? Why does that seem more right? Like, I mean, slavery is not something that we generally think of as right, right?
But it's not as bad as killing.
Yeah, this is basically a kind of arbitrary murder, right? Killing someone who discovered something inconvenient, right? It wasn't his fault. Right? This is just basically carrying out, state-sanctioned murder to preserve the status quo, right? To avoid the Sultan being embarrassed. Whereas if he is auctioned off, right, yeah, it's humiliating. But this also provides the greater benefit to the people, right? And resolves the problem. And it also shows what about the ruler. What is it if the ruler willingly follows the law and puts himself up for auction, rather than simply killing the inconvenient people who have caused this problem for him, or who have brought this problem to his attention, rather they didn't cause the problem. What does that show about him? Okay. That he's not afraid of embarrassment, sure. That embarrassment isn't the worst thing in the world, right?
He's like doing it good example of like following the law, so like the
Uh-huh.
people would do the same thing and not resort to like crime and stuff.
Okay, yeah, setting a good example, right? And if he follows the law himself, if he makes himself subject to the law, where does he then stand in relation to it? Is he saying that the ruler is above the law then? No, the ruler is subject to it like everyone else, right? So, the idea here is enforcing a principle of equality under law, right? That everybody has to follow the same laws, even the sultan. Whereas, if he just kills the inconvenient people, what kind of leader is he showing himself to be then? What kind of ruler is he showing himself to be? Okay.
Like you just, if you're in a problem, you just like kill people, get yourself out of it, and like resort to like committing crime and stuff.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it would be criminal, right? He wouldn't be following the law. So he would be asserting then that he is above the law, right? And did the people that he's punishing actually do anything wrong? No. The only thing they've done is inconvenience him. So he would not only show himself to be above the law then, right? He'd also show himself to be arbitrary and cruel, right? So this does have a pretty specific historical context that I want to kind of dig into for a minute. So the play is written in 1960, but it's talking about Egypt in the 14th century, right? But it's using the 14th century to make some points about Egypt in 1960, right? So the playwright, Tawfiq al-Hakim, was born in 1898, dies in 1987. And he lives through a period of pretty substantial political change in Egypt, right? So when he's born, Egypt is under British dominion, right? It's been colonized by the British Empire. By the time he dies, it's an independent country, but it's an independent country under military dictatorship. And one of the things I think al-Hakim is doing in 1960 is showing a different direction the country could have gone in, had things played out a little differently, right? So al-Hakim is a supporter in 1952 of a revolution in Egypt led by a group called the Free Officers Movement. So the Free Officers, they're called Free Officers because they're army officers, they're military, who refuse to continue to carry out the orders of the king. So the demands these guys make are first, that the Egyptian monarchy be abolished. Second, an end to British occupation of Egypt, right? So depose the king and get the Brits out. They also wanted the establishment of a democratic republic with an elected government. And in 1956, one of the two leaders of this movement, Gamal Abdel Nasser, I don't know why I can't spell today, is elected president. And a lot of Al-Hakim's play, at least this particular play, can actually be read as a kind of veiled criticism of a lot of things that Nasser does in the late 1950s. Nasser, by the way, was a huge fan of Al-Hakim's work. Al-Hakim was his favorite writer, and it probably caused some tension for him to know that some of this stuff was aimed at him. But when he becomes president in 1956, so he begins the process of decolonization, right? So that is like getting rid of the last vestiges of British rule in Egypt, right? Reforming institutions so they're not imitations of British institutions, putting Egyptians into prominent positions, things of that nature, right? You know, promoting Egyptian culture and Egyptian interests over those of the Brits. He also tries to modernize and industrialize the economy. And he institutes a number of socialist economic reforms, right? And one thing I do want to note here, because this is where we get into slightly iffy territory, we tend in the United States, because of Cold War propaganda, to equate socialism with totalitarianism. So I want to remind people that like countries like Denmark and Norway and Sweden and Finland that have very free presses and a great deal of personal freedom, so our citizens enjoy a great deal of personal freedoms, also have socialist economies. So these two things aren't, socialism and totalitarianism aren't necessarily the same thing, right? But what Nasser does is he nationalizes certain key industries. Does anybody know what it means to nationalize an industry? If you nationalize an industry, who owns it technically? Yeah. Basically what happens, right, is the state administers a particular industry on behalf of the people, right? And at least theoretically, the profits made by that industry are then reinvested back into the country. So again, to use Norway as an example, right, you know, the North Sea oil fields are run by a government company that then uses the proceeds to pay for things like infrastructure and education and things like that, right? So this actually causes a kind of national crisis when Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal. In part because it's one of the major transport routes for oil out of the Persian Gulf, right? So the British were used to owning it, right? The British had built it, the British had previously owned it, and they were used to getting the money from charging ships to come through the canal. So this causes a brief and relatively minor war with Britain, with France, and with Israel. And Nasser responds by becoming increasingly dictatorial. For example, when Israel declares war on Egypt, and Israel is the first of those three countries to declare war on Egypt. Nasser suspends all civil rights protections for Jewish citizens of Egypt, right? So he makes a lot of these kinds of moves that directly impact people's civil rights. Are we seeing here perhaps any connection yet with Al-Hakim's play? When the leader starts punishing arbitrarily those who oppose him, right? This is what the Qadi offers as the way of the sword, right? Really kind of the way of the authoritarian, right? Do as I say or I'll punish you. So, given that the country's leadership is becoming increasingly dictatorial, how safe do you think it would be for a playwright, even one who is the favorite writer of the president, to make any kind of direct criticism? Probably not very, right? Yeah. So you can only stick your neck out so far, right? Without knowing that it's going to get chopped. So what Al-Hakim does is adopt techniques that were pioneered by a German playwright in the 1930s by the name of Bertolt Brecht. And none of you have heard of Brecht. Nobody's aware of Bertolt Brecht. Nobody's read Mother, Courage, and Her Children in high school or anything like that. Okay, I really need to talk to people's high school teachers. So the thing that Brecht is most famous for is trying to promote a kind of intellectual drama, right, that is based on getting people to pay close attention to ideas rather than getting emotionally involved in the story, right? So Brecht's problem with most drama is that it wraps you up too deeply in the emotional lives of the characters and thus doesn't really get you thinking about the ideas at the center of the play, right? So he develops a couple of techniques for getting people to realize, like to understand that they're just watching a play, right? To constantly remind you that you're just watching a play, that this isn't real, and that you shouldn't get wrapped up in it. So one of the things that we see in this kind of play is what's called breaking the fourth wall. Any of you ever heard of this before? Anybody know what this is? Okay, so have you ever watched like a TV show or a play or a movie where a character kind of steps out of the action and starts talking to the audience? Yeah, that's called breaking the fourth wall. And that's a technique that's pioneered by Brecht in the 30s, right?
Would that be like Ferris Bueller's Day Off?
Yeah. Matthew Broderick breaks the fourth wall through that whole movie, right? He's constantly looking at the camera and talking to you, right? Rather than talking to the other people around him. Yeah, that's breaking the fourth wall. Another thing that you'll see in a play that is either by Brecht or influenced by Brecht is you often have large casts with actors playing multiple roles. Right? The idea there is to get you not to identify the actor with the character too closely, right? So you'll say you'll have a play where maybe a character is shot to death in one scene, and then the actor comes back in a different costume later on, right? So you see, oh, it's the same actor playing a different role, right? You don't identify the actors with the roles. You will also sometimes have costume changes and set changes done in plain view of the audience, right? So instead of the curtain coming down or the stage going dark or whatever and people moving set pieces off, the actors will pick up and move around the set pieces. Sometimes they'll change their costumes right there in front of you, right? Again, to remind you that you're just watching a scene in a play. To make the world of the play look less real and less stable. And the last element, this is the one that Al-Hakim is really using here, is historicization. Right, that is kind of using another historical era, right, a past historical era, to make a point about the one that you're in. So, Brecht wrote an anti-war play in the late 1930s called Mother Courage and Her Children, which was initially intended to be performed in his native Germany. And if Brecht had wanted to write a play about war in the 1930s, what would have been the most immediate historical resource available to him? Like, what would have been the most immediate the most immediate war he could have drawn on at that time?
In the 30s?
Yeah, in the 30s. World War II hasn't happened yet, but it's about, he could have drawn World War I, right? 20 years prior. But he doesn't. Now, if what he wants to do is distance the audience emotionally from the material, why would he avoid choosing World War I as the setting for his play?
A lot of people died and were made sad.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think we're thinking along the right lines, right? But World War I ended in 1918, right? This is 1938.
It's really relative.
Yeah, this is something. It's a war that's still in living. Yeah, it's still in living memory, right? There might be people who were veterans in the audience, or people who lost family members, or who lost their homes, or whatever, right? The problem with that war would be, for Brecht, that people would have too strong an emotional response to it. So instead, he chooses to set the play in a similar 17th century war called the 30 Years' War. It was, you don't need to know the details of the 30 Years' War, right? What we do need to understand just is the way he's using that earlier period that people have no particular emotional attachment to and that nobody alive remembers to make a point about the present, right? So the period that Al-Hakim is drawing on in Egyptian history to make a point about 1960 is the Mamluk Sultanate. So the Mamluks were originally elite slave soldiers in Egyptian armies who were not themselves of Egyptian origin, right? They were some of them were Turkish, some of them were from the Caucasus, some of them were from Central Asia. They were drawn from all over the place. And the Mamluks become the dominant force in the military, in the Egyptian military, by the end of the 9th century. This also gives them a lot of influence in the Sultan's courts. And in 1250, they assassinate an unpopular sultan by the name of Turanshah. Whose position of authority has been weakened by the Crusades. And then, from 1250 to 1517, they are the rulers of Egypt. So we can actually find, I think, some pretty direct analogs between this and this free officers movement and their revolution, right? Where do we see similarities here between the Mamluks and their takeover of Egypt and the free officers' revolution in 1952?
What's your question, sorry?
Where do we see similarities between this free officers' revolution of 1952 in Egypt and the Mamluk takeover in 1250? How are they similar to each other?
Military force.
Yeah, they both originate in the military, right? Good. What else? What's one of the things the free officers objected to about Egypt in the 1950s? Who did they want out of Egypt?
The British?
Yeah, they wanted the British out, right? They wanted Europeans out of Egypt, right? And what was it that weakened the Sultan the Mamluks assassinated? The Crusades, right? Yeah, and another invasion of Egypt by Europeans, right?
What are crusades? Are those soldiers?
Does anybody know what the Crusades were? Okay, I got to talk to your history teachers
The
too.
Last Crusade, Indiana Jones. That's the only thing that I
Okay, okay, yeah.
Crusades.
All right, wow. Okay, so the Crusades were a series of religious wars in the Middle Ages, right? What set off the first crusade was that a group of European knights kidnapped and sexually assaulted an Egyptian princess. So in response, her brother, who was the Sultan, closed off European access to a bunch of pilgrimage sites in the Holy Land. And so, in response, the Pope at the time called for Christian knights to go and free these holy sites so that European Christians could once again visit them. What actually ended up happening was a huge violent land grab, mostly by younger sons of noble families who weren't going to inherit the property, right? So they all sign up so that they can get themselves territory in the Middle East. And there are crusader kingdoms that persist in Egypt and the Arabian Peninsula for a couple hundred years, but they're constantly at war with their Arab neighbors. So yeah, so the Crusades are kind of one of those originary points of conflict between Europe and the Middle East, right? Something that still kind of comes up in like one of those kind of historical forces that rears its ugly head, you know, in relations between those parts of the world even today. But yeah, so in both cases, one of the things that weakens the existing government is the presence of Europeans in the country, right? So we have here actually a pretty solid historical analog for the things that are going on in Al-Hakim's country in 1960, right? So let's, with the time we've got left, let's talk a little bit about how these characters try to resolve this, right? So we've looked a little bit at some of the advice that the Qadi gives to the Sultan, right? So what is the Qadi, the judge, suggesting the Sultan should do?
Follow the law.
Yeah, follow the law, right? Which, being a judge, is also his area of particular expertise, right?
Didn't you say though that like if he went for the sword or whatever, he would probably have to kill the Qadi too?
Yeah.
So he
Uh-huh.
kind of just defending himself.
Sure. Yeah, so I guess, you know, one could claim a certain level of self-interest there, right? You know, he's also, you know, he is, you know, he does say on page 345 when the Sultan draws his sword, right? He says, "It is a great honor for me, Your Majesty, to die by your hand and for me to give up my life for the sake of truth and principles." So he is willing to die for the sake of the principle of law, right? Now, the other advisor who's present in this dialogue is the king's vizier. So a vizier is something more like a prime minister, right? Kind of like the head of the king's government. And vizier in Arabic literally means one who bears burdens. What does the vizier want to happen?
Isn't he the one that the Sultan kept asking for his advice? When he was like, what should I do? I don't know if it was him or somebody else, but they were like, I don't want to like, he's like, I can't tell you like what I think you should do because of like what might happen in the future and how it might like affect him if he tells him what to do.
Yeah. Neither of these guys actually wants to tell the king exactly what to do, right? Because it's not their place. What, pardon?
Don't
No.
want to be blamed.
They could also be blamed for, yeah, whatever the outcome is. Let's look on page 345. Can I get, can you continue reading the Qadi, please, Hannah? And can I get a volunteer to read the vizier?
You said 345?
345, yeah, bottom of the page. We'll start with, O Chief Qadi, be tractable and obliging.
I'll read the card.
Okay. The vizier. Be the she'll be the Qadi.
Oh.
Be the vizier, yep. So start with O Chief Qadi in the middle of the page, be tractable and obliging.
O Chief Qadi, be tractable and obliging. Don't be rigid and hard, meet us halfway. Find a compromise and work with us towards finding a reasonable solution.
There's no reasonable way out other than the law.
We put the Sultan up for sale by auction,
Yes.
and the person he's knocked down to buys him.
He manumits?
Manumits, yep.
Manumits him immediately at the session for drawing up the contract. That's the condition.
And who will accept to lose his money in this manner?
Many people, those who would ransom the Sultan's freedom with their money.
Then why don't we ourselves undertake this duty, you and I, and ransom our Sultan secretly with our own money and gain this honor? Is it not an appropriate idea?
I'm afraid not. It cannot be secret. The law is specific in that it lays down that every sale of the properties of the exchequer must be carried out publicly and by general auction.
Don't trouble yourself with him. He's determined to disgrace us.
For the last time, Chief Cotty, is there no stratagem for extracting this from the imposter?
A stratagem? I'm not the person to ask to look for stratagems.
Okay, so what? A stratagem?
Yeah.
You're about to ask what that is? Okay, so stratagem. Think about words that this sounds like.
Strategy?
It sounds like strategy, right? So a stratagem, like, what is a strategy?
A plan of action?
Yeah, it's a plan, right? So stratagems are small elements of a plan, right? Usually little kind of tricks or loopholes. So what is the vizier proposing they do to resolve the problem?
Them to just buy them off and everything so they don't have to embarrass him, I guess?
Yeah, I think what's important is not so much what he proposes they do, is how he proposes they do it, right? What is he seeking to avoid?
Public humiliation?
The public auction. Yeah, he doesn't want the public auction, right? It's like, okay, well, why don't you and I, Cotty, between ourselves, right, settle this? We'll buy the Sultan, we'll set him free, and then nobody has to get embarrassed, right? So what the vizier is looking for is some kind of compromise solution, right? That preserves the Sultan's dignity. But why won't the Cadi agree to this?
Because according to the law, it has to be public auction.
Yeah, it can't be secret, right? This has to be open to the public. So we can see that the Cadi is associated with openness and with transparency, right? We have to be honest about this. While the vizier is opting for secrecy, right? We have to keep this quiet. We can't let people know. So what that openness and transparency are associated with the law, and secrecy is related to the sword, right? How does this make sense? How does this make logical sense? What does a government by the sword, as the play seems to argue, care most about?
How he looks to other people.
Yeah, how you look to other people, right? To what end? Okay, yeah, you use violence to enforce your will on other people, right? But then why do you use things like secrecy and violence? What is your only goal if you're governing by the sword?
I guess some things will go right just for you and you don't really care about everybody else.
Yeah, the whole idea is just about preserving your own power, right? If you're governing by the sword, if you're governing by kind of like arbitrary force and violence, right, then all you care about is maintaining your own position. Whereas if you're governing by law, right, then what you care about is fairness. What you care about is the public interest, right? So secrecy and the sword are connected with one's own private interest, while the law and openness are connected with the public interest. Right? Not only does there have to be an auction, there has to be a general public auction that everybody needs to know about. And the money has to go to benefit the people. So, if we look on page, bottom of page 346, the way the Qadi frames the choice for the Sultan here, right? Says, I mean that you have a choice, Your Majesty. You can employ it for action, your sword, that is, or you can employ it for decoration. I recognize the undoubted strength possessed by the sword, its swift action and decisive effect. But the sword gives right to the strongest, and who knows who will be the strongest tomorrow. There may appear some strong person who will tilt the balance of power against you. As for the law, it protects your rights from every aggression, because it does not recognize the strongest, it recognizes right. And now there's nothing for you to do, Your Majesty, but choose between the sword which imposes and yet exposes you, and between the law which threatens and yet protects you. So, what's the problem with relying on the sword that the Qadi points out here?
It gives the right to the strongest, but you don't know who's going to be strong tomorrow.
Yeah, you might be the strongest today, right? But somebody stronger could come along tomorrow and overthrow you, right? Just as the Mamluks came to power by overthrowing Turan Shah, right? And the free officers came to power by overthrowing King Farouk. Right, so, rule by the strongest only guarantees that the person who is strongest now rules, right? So by setting that up as your principle, you maybe protect yourself today, but you expose yourself to danger tomorrow. Whereas following the law might expose you to embarrassment today, but sets up a clear set of rules that everyone is expected to follow, right? Strong or weak, right? It doesn't recognize physical strength. It recognizes, it recognizes right and wrong. And so when the Sultan does have to make his choice, right, I think this is where it shows a kind of different direction Al-Hakim thought this 1952 revolution could have taken, right? Instead of choosing the sword and what looks like the easier way out, the Sultan does choose the law and to put himself up for auction. To set that example for, for his subjects, right? Putting the people first and his own interests second. All right, so we're about out of time. Does anybody have any questions about any of this? All right, so you're going to read Leviathan for next time, or the excerpt from Leviathan. Leviathan is a very, very long book, and of course, I'm not expecting you to read all of it, just the bits that are in Reading the World. Where the hell is the remote? once you've got this down, we are done and you are free to go. Yes?
May I take a picture of it?
No, I'd rather you write it down. And I'm not just being arbitrary and mean here. If you write it down, you're more likely to remember it, you're more likely to think about it. And if you take a picture. Once you're done, you can go. Oh, you just got stuck. You too.